Good evening, folks. We are calling to order our regular board meeting of the Marin Municipal Water District for June 20th. Can I get a roll call?
Yes, good evening. Vice President Ranjiv Kush,
Here.
Director Larry Russell, Director Matt Sampson,
Here.
Director Jed Smith,
Here.
and President Monty Schmidt.
Here. Next, adoption of the agenda. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved. Second.
Are there any public comments on the closed session items only?
There are none.
Can I get a roll call, Terry?
Yes. Vice President Kush,
Aye.
Director Russell, Director Sampson,
Aye.
Director Smith,
Aye.
and President Schmidt.
Aye. With that, we are going to convene to a closed session and we'll re-adjourn at 6:30 p.m.
He is not on right now. Yep. I have not received a response from him.
What's that?
Recording is in progress.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, we are reconvening our board meeting here from our closed session, which ended at 6:35 with no reportable actions. And so moving forward, do we have any comments on items not on the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, fantastic. Do we have any directors and general managers announcements? I'll start with my left here. Larry.
Yes, I attended the American Waterworks meeting in Toronto, Canada, last week with Ben and a couple of the staff, Alex and Mark from MMWD. It was a very productive meeting, fairly well attended. I think it reflected being in Canada in part. Toronto is a pretty expensive city and it impacts the attendees. But it was a meeting, and there's another one coming in Anaheim next year at this time, the middle of June. And we'll be talking more about that, integrating the board and the staff and trying to increase MMWD's visibility in the professional area with more papers. And because we've got a number of things that are very interesting, led, for instance, by the issue of paving. That is a particularly hot topic in all the water districts. So those are the kind of professional topics that come with it. So it was a good meeting.
Okay, thank you. Ranjiv?
Yes. So recently, Larry and I attended a celebration marking the expansion of the Las Colinas Valley Sanitary District. Very impressive project. It was infrastructure development over 4 years with an investment of almost $68 million that has improved their wastewater treatment capacity from 8 million gallons a day up to 8 million gallons. It's expanded recycled water treatment facility from 1.4 million gallons a day to 5.4 million gallons. The expanded recycled water treatment facility was done in collaboration with Marin Water, And it's now supplying recycled water to us as well as North Marin Water District. So it was I think, quite an impressive accomplishment over 4 years that to me seemed to go in the face sometimes of what we hear about how long and how hard it is to do big infrastructure projects.
You're forgetting about the 40 years before that it took him to get to this point.
Got it.
Yeah, it was like pulling teeth on both ends, MMWD's end and on their end, trying to, the reclaimed water plant that was out there, I think it dates back to the 80s, something like that, 1980 or so. And Marin made the statement, which is true as far as I can tell, that there were more toilets flushing on the Marin recycled water system than there are anywhere else in California. So things like the Embassy Suites and the City Civic Center, they're all flushing with reclaimed water. And people like Autodesk, who's just up on the hill above them, told us that they would move out of Marin if they didn't get the reclaimed water. So it has an impact on people. Unfortunately, it's a pretty expensive system to expand, even though we were helped, and we helped financially. We backed the bond, as I recall, for the expansion of this, at least the reclaimed portion of the plant. And they took over our combined chlorine contact tank and storage, which is up on the hill. We built it 5 years ago, maybe, or 10, for $7 million. So it was a big chunk of change. Probably one of the most expensive tanks we have of that size in the system. So it has been a joint effort for a long time. Probably the single biggest thing that it did was to relocate the intake from the ponds to the treatment plant, which may not seem like much, but what that does is it eliminates the removal of algae, which was the primary factor in our plant. The most complicated part of our plant was removal of the algae from the ponds. So that's gone now, and they're able to take the water as it comes as effluent directly into the reclaimed, and then they put it through membranes and make it into at least a Title 23 water.
Yes, good evening. I'd like to start by saying thank you to the watershed staff, Sean Horn, and then our head ranger, Don Wick, for facilitating a tour for Director Cush and I on Friday. We got to ride with our senior ranger, Matt Circle, for the afternoon, and it was just a very educational experience for a big chunk of the watershed. Look forward to another one and highly recommend riding along with the history book, living history book for our district. Just a very impressive wealth of
A
knowledge.
description of Matt.
Very much so. But you know, it was hard to not notice all the work we have to do out there. And it was a sobering reminder of how much vegetation is sitting out there just ripe to burn. And it was actually ironic that a Marin Voice came out this week by a gentleman, Bruce Goings, who is part of the MWPA and he's a Novato Fire Board director, and wrote on the same topic, not exclusive of our lands, but just in general for Marin County and the work we needed to do, which tied together well for the watershed committee meeting on Thursday of last week. We actually talked about expanding, or not expanding, but altering a little bit of the BIFIP in terms of what we can do in terms of vegetation management. And we'll look to bring that in front of the full board on the 11th of July. But it was good to see that we're using adaptive management to constantly change the way we're doing things to make improvements specifically around the vegetation management. So looking forward to seeing that on the calendar on the 11th. At the same meeting, we talked about the rec management plan, got an update on that. Sean provided a summary of the community workshops and then the visitor user surveys or census surveys. And just a reminder, the full census survey results are all posted in the full report that's posted online for that. And we look forward to a draft plan in fall and then hopefully a final plan adopted towards the end of this calendar year. Same meeting, we also talked about a second ranger trainee position for the district, combining 3 ranger aid positions into that, and something that I'm very much excited to see go in front of us on consent tonight. It's great to see more rangers out there, but one of the concerns was the ranger housing element and making sure that we kept the capability of allowing rangers to sleep on the watershed just for safety overall, but also as something that most open space districts or land managers provide for their trainees. So looking into how we get funding to make sure that those ranger homes are up to date. And I believe it's part of the budget tonight, which is good to see, but taking a look what kind of potential we have for employee housing as we get out there. But the ranger trainee position is pretty neat because it expands the applicant pool. So we might find some applicants this time around that we haven't seen in this position. So it's gonna be excited to see what we come up with that. Lastly, from the same meeting, we got an update on the watershed fisheries, the monitoring and tagging program, but we got to see the results of the coho salmon population in Lagunitas Creek this year and seeing how high those numbers are. It was really refreshing to see some positive news coming out of there. So kudos to all the work that's been going on there. End of report.
Sure, Larry.
I forgot, this is a report on the Operations Committee. It was provided to me by Terry. She did a great job. The staff provided an overview to the committee on a pipeline extension agreement for the Alta Robles development project in Tiburon, along with an explanation to the board of what the pipeline extension agreements were that Crystal and her gang put on, which was very useful. The committee referred the item to tonight's board meeting, which is on the consent calendar for the board to consider for approval. This is a 14 lot development on a fairly large piece of land. So it has a potential for a fair amount of water usage on Paradise Drive. Staff provided an update on the Warren Springs Road Slide Repair Project. The committee referred that item to the future board meeting. It's a 60-foot long, 6-foot high retaining wall to stabilize the side of that hill. Staff provided an overview of the Phase 2 spillway condition assessment report. This is required by the Division of Dam Safety after the Oroville event. And it looks at the spillways to ensure that Peters Dam, Seeger Dam, and Sulahuli Dam are all suitably protected by an adequate spillway. It involves a ground penetrating radar inspection. The district has purchased the ground penetrating radar per our previous discussions about this, which I think is a great idea. And they will look at the concrete, look at what's underneath, and conduct subdrain cleaning and video surveys of the subdrains to ensure that they're ready to go in the event the spillway is needed. This item was referred to future board meeting to be considered for approval. And these reports and the video of the meeting are available on the webpage. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry. General Manager's announcements. Oh,
I'll just make a couple of quick, comments. Interesting, Matt, the idea of having more employee housing, ranger housing available for folks. I am increasingly aware of the importance of how difficult it is for our staff to commute in from far away. And I'm super curious about where that takes us. I was able to meet with Jared Huffman and Cory Booker, Senator from New Jersey, and some other folks, and the topic came up about our ability to get access to the Army Corps of Engineers funds that have been allocated and for us. And the message was, let's get it going, guys. Let's not dilly-dally. That funding's available for us to build more water supply. And there was encouragement to have a regional approach to come up with supply and storage options. And I would say we get on that sooner than later.
Thank you. Any other directors' announcements?
I do.
General Manager.
I have a couple of brief announcements. At the last board meeting, there was a question I said I would bring back in general manager comments at the next board meeting, which is tonight on the North Marin Aqueduct. The latest is based on inspections, they have decided to replace a portion of the North Marin Aqueduct. Somewhere it looks like maybe 40 feet, could be up to 80 feet. So pretty small piece. Based on inspections, they saw a deflection. I think it's the right thing to do. So it's great news. We, definitely rely on that aqueduct. There's a lot of coordination they're doing with Caltrans. Caltrans is building, the work will certainly wait until Caltrans is done the retaining wall by the slide. Caltrans also has plans to do a retaining wall down by 101 as well. So a lot of coordination going on. I'd expect the work to be done sometime this fall. The second item wanted to share, we'll be coming back to the board with more information. There was a grand jury report that came out a few days ago dealing with ADUs and the challenges with all the utility fees and other jurisdictional requirements and that create perhaps a barrier for moving forward with ADUs, as well as perhaps difficulty navigating all the different requirements and getting these constructed. We are, as many jurisdictions are, required to respond by sometime in September. So we'll be bringing this item back and reviewing it with the board.
It should be noted that Paradise Drive expansion, the pipeline extension, all 14 lots have ADUs.
Right.
Built by the builder. Their 500 square foot ADUs are with each house. So it's obviously the future.
Okay. That's all I had.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we'll move on to our consent calendar. Can I get a motion to adopt our consent calendar?
So moved.
Second.
Do we have any public comments on our consent calendar?
There are none.
Okay, can we get a roll call vote, Carrie?
Yes. Vice President Kush,
Aye.
Director Russell,
Hi.
Director Sampson,
Aye.
Director Smith,
Hi,
and President Schmidt.
Aye. Okay, with that, we are going to move on to our item 6, which is adoption of the proposed fiscal year 2023-24 budget. And that
sorry,
brings Brett.
Monty, maybe I missed it and I didn't see it in the agenda. Was there an approval of the minutes?
They're covered in the,
Though there was none for this.
there's none for this.
There was
Yes, thanks.
None, no approval for the previous board meeting minutes?
That is correct.
They'll be in the next packet.
So we'll approve 2 sets of minutes?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's just an oversight or?
Believe we had staff on vacation. And so we always want to be thorough and make sure we're doing things correctly. And so we put that over until the next board meeting. It's actually not that unusual.
It's not a requirement for us to approve minutes in every.
It's
board
not.
meeting. Okay, thanks.
Take it away, Brett.
All right. Good evening, directors. My name is Brett Uppendahl. I'm the finance director for the district. And tonight we have for your consideration the budget adoption for fiscal year 23-24 and fiscal year 24-25. Here on the screen that I think you can see is the agenda for tonight. We'll start with a budget overview, talk a little bit more about the budget process, provide some budget summaries. I will summarize the key cost drivers and budget enhancements that are included in the budget. I'll turn it over here to Alicia to go over the capital improvement program, and then we'll come back for next steps. And before I get too far in this, I did want to again thank staff for all their work over this past year. The budget here, as it's noted in the staff report and the attachments, does reflect the rate setting process the district went through over the past number of months. And so there is nothing new here. It's just representing all the decisions and priorities your board has made over the last couple months. And so I just want to thank staff and again, the board for your direction and for listening to us as we've been here for many meetings throughout the year. So thank you. Just as an overview here, this kind of summarizes what you'll see in front of you today. Our total budget here for fiscal year 23-24 is $142 million. That does represent a significant increase of 22% compared to the prior year budget. And Alicia and I will talk through what the changes there are. And we have 2 primary funds in the budget. For our operating fund is $104 million. That's a 13% increase. That covers our day-to-day operations and maintenance. It also covers our debt service payments for the capital program. Our capital fund is an additional 32 or 33 million here, 32.9 million. That has the most significant increase, as we'll talk through today, a 38% increase in the first year. That covers our core CIP program, our capital improvement program, as well as water supply projects that are new this year. And it also covers operating expenses such as vehicle and equipment replacement that can be capitalized. As a reminder, we do here at the district have a 2-year budget process. And so we'll be presenting numbers for the 2-year period. And we will come back to the board next year as a mid-cycle review, just to make sure we have everything in order before we go on to that second year. As we go into the budget process, we were certainly guided by the goals here at the district. And so I'll show those here on the screen. First and foremost was to strengthen our water supply reliability in the face of extreme droughts. Secondly, as was mentioned here in the initial comments, to build upon our water and wildfire resiliency efforts in the Mountain Town watershed. Third, keep pace with inflation and invest in our aging infrastructure. And then finally, replenish the reserves that we used during the drought to prepare for future uncertainties. And then here's a slide kind of that gives you a visual of the budget process here at the district. And it's a long process, as I mentioned in the beginning. We do work on this pretty much year round, from kind of wrapping up the prior year to the initial kind of outline for the budget year, and then starting to work on prioritization. But just to go through the slide here, in the late summer, we wrap up the fiscal year, which ends in June. So it takes us a month or so to close the books. That's when we do most of our internal analysis. In the fall, we look at what the baseline budget update would be. And you heard the word baseline a few times tonight. Baseline really just means kind of the core budget that we essentially had here at the district from year to year, just to keep the lights on and kind of keep operations running. So baseline budget is really kind of the prior year's budget that it takes to keep operations moving on a day-to-day basis here. Within that, we have to look at both sides, both revenues and expenses. And so when we get to the winter, we overlay that with division budget meetings, meaning we meet with each division. We find out from their perspective where the emerging needs are for funding, if they have any proposed enhancements, if we have any non-discretionary or mandatory expenses coming our way from the state or federal level. In the spring, we bring it out more to more of a public process with district-wide prioritization. We talk through some of the bigger expenditures and incorporate the board's priorities into the spending plan. In the years where we have a rate study, we do what's called the cost of service study. And so that will set the rates based on the revenue required to meet the expenses that we lay out. And then we turn that back into a budget document that we have here today. So in the early summertime this year, it was in early May, we did a budget study session. And so the board will recall that we spent an evening kind of going through each and every division's operating budget. Talked about some of the work plan priorities as well as the expense drivers for each division. We also took a deeper dive into the CIP to start talking about by categories where we're going to be allocating the funds for the year. This year, we also had a rate hearing to go through the way in which we're going to provide funds for the budget. And then now we make our way to this last piece of the puzzle here, budget adoption on the bottom right for your board's consideration here today. In terms of some of those inputs, and again, you've seen some of these slides in the past, but in terms of some of the inputs that we go through within our baseline operating budget, we had a deficit this year, a pretty significant deficit, and that was largely caused by reduced demand, historically low levels of demand here in terms of water sales. We also saw historically high inflation in terms of cost drivers, and in particular, I'll go through again some of the bigger ticket items when it comes to the inflationary cost drivers. I think here at the district, we always have a focus on deferred maintenance, knowing that we're over 100 years old. We have a lot of aging infrastructure in the ground that has its existing life cycles. We're coming up on many of those life cycles, as Alicia will talk through, in the sense that we did put a lot of capital into the ground in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that's making its way through its 50 and 60 and 70-year expected life. So what we did as part of the rate setting process is we took an analysis of kind of how far behind we are on deferred maintenance. And so my bullet there says our aging system requires more than double the existing capital budget to maintain pace with replacement and improvement needs. And so, going into this process, we had about a $20 million capital budget. And we would have needed to add 24 million a year in order to just maintain pace with the expected maintenance and replacement. And so as Alicia will talk about, the board gave direction to phase our way into that and get to about half of what's required each year. So it'll be a continuous challenge here at the district to maintain pace with deferred maintenance across all of our asset classes. But as again, Alicia will talk about, I think this budget represents a really good direction, a step in the right direction towards being able to fund that fully. Water supply roadmap. We've had quite a few meetings on water supply, so I won't spend a lot of time here. But the gist of it is that this budget has new expenditures, as we'll show, for water supply. That includes 3 basic categories. So short-term, no regrets projects that we can move on immediately. Longer-term projects that may require additional studies. And so the funding is laid out for that path, as well as setting up a dedicated reserve fund for future water supply projects. So kind of the three supporting or 3 kind of prong factors that go into the roadmap for water supply. Finally, we did talk about some levels of service enhancements here at the district. And so we'll talk through how we have included in the budget additional funding for the watershed BIFIP program in terms of vegetation management out on the watershed. We also have additional funding for a ranger trainee, for an HR training position, and for a valve exercising crew. So again, we went through a kind of a needs assessment there and found out the highest needs and where we can really get the best bang for our buck in terms of service enhancements. And those are included in the budget. And then finally, replenishing our reserves and investing in technology over the long term. We also have money in the budget dedicated for that. So here's a slide of how the dollars shake out in terms of between operating and capital there at the top. This is largely the same as the slides we showed in the budget study session. We have included in here now our fire flow fund and some of our non-rate revenues. And so the rate, what we showed in the early May was more rate-based revenues. And so this adds in, again, the fire flow fee and some of our non-rate revenue. But you can see there the operating fund across the top, we're seeing about a 13% increase in fiscal year 23-24 proposed. And that is largely catching up to inflationary factors over the last 2-year cycle. So we've, again, we have a 2-year budget. So when we look at the 22-23 budget there, that was actually set, the better part of 2 years ago. And so as we've seen inflation start to tick up over the last couple of years, just to reset ourselves and kind of get back on pace with our mandatory operational costs, it's about 13% in the first year. You'll see that the operations line goes down to 5% in the second year as we get down to kind of a more normal inflationary expectation for year 2 of the budget. Capital and fire flow funds have a much bigger increase as those represent the increased funding for deferred maintenance and for water supply projects. And so that's a 38% increase in the first year. And then as I started to mention, we've phased those in, meaning more expenditures in each year, over the next 4 years. And so it's actually another 50% increase in the second year there in the capital lines. Contributions to reserves. This is the first year we have this in the budget as well. So 0 last year, 5 million this year. That's split evenly between a water supply reserve and our unrestricted reserve. And that's unchanged in the second year. So 5 million flat each year for our 2 reserve funds. The second panel there in the slide is a different way of breaking down the same numbers. So in terms of, by category or by expenditure area. So personnel services at the top, a modest change there, 2% across the board in this year, and then 4% next year. Service and supplies is a much bigger category there that really takes into account all the operational and inflationary impacts that I was mentioning in earlier slides. Higher in the first year as we catch up, a little bit less in the second year as we get to a more normal kind of inflationary environment. Debt service has seen a slight decline. We did refinance our existing debts about 1.5 years ago. And as those schedules make their way through, we are seeing a little bit of savings there. And we're expecting actually to retire one of our existing smaller debts next year. So slight declines in our debt service each year over the 2-year planning period. And then again, capital projects and the baseline is increasing modestly, 11 and 12%, as you can see there. And then it's the new expenditures there for capital enhancements, water supply, and reserves that really bring the totals up. And so capital enhancements, again, you can see starts at 3.6 million this year and will increase next year to 10 million. Similarly, water supply for the proposed 23-24 starts at 2.75 and then gets to a more full funding in the second year of 9.2 million. So we'll talk through those in the capital slides, but this provides an overview of those expenditure areas.
Regarding the refinance, did Morgan Stanley resell the bonds? It actually hasn't happened yet, right? It's like 24?
I'd have to look at the details there. We haven't gotten any notice from Morgan Stanley on any change, so we're still making the payments to the same.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually happened. What I remember is that Morgan Stanley purchased made the commitment to the entire amount, but obviously they're not going to sit on it. They're going to get rid of it, I think.
I would assume so. I mean, I don't know their operation as well, but I think for the district, it was taking advantage of a good low rate environment, and it saved us a couple $100,000 a year, and I believe 14 million over the life of the.
Yeah,
debt
it was
service.
a
So
lot.
it was
Yeah.
it was good.
It might be a good idea to have Jim come in from Sperry and talk a little bit to the board about that, about where we are. I know Jed had asked about refinancing, and basically we're foreclosed on refinancing because of that, as I recall, of that event.
Yeah, there are definitely some agreements we have there, and I think we have some limitations on how we can refinance, especially now with a higher rate environment. I'm not sure if it'd be a good time now, but over the next 2 years, it's certainly something we need to take a
Yeah.
look at.
Thanks.
So this is a pie chart that shows our expenditures by category, and it gives a kind of a more visual sense for the numbers I gave on the prior slide. I think when I look at this, I see at the top left there, personnel services, about 40% of the budget. All the work that we do here, the majority of the work we do here is with our staff. We're a service-based organization, takes people to do what we do each day. So 40% of our budget is dedicated for our staff. If you look on the right-hand side there, operations and capital projects together, that's about 50% of our budget, just on regular operating costs, producing water, making water, delivering the water, and then our capital projects. So a good 50% of our budget goes towards those two areas. You can see there in the bottom left in the yellow and green, debt service is less than 10%, about 7% of our budget. And then now that we have reserve contributions, those bring up about 4% of the budget each year. On the revenue side, so how do we pay for the operations that we do? This is how it breaks out. On the top there are rate revenues. And so water sales being the biggest change there. Again, as we went through the rate setting process, I think that's where we landed on, was to put the majority of the funding needs into the volumetric or the variable water sales category. That way our customers have a greater control of their expenses, and that way it's a better alignment, or kind of a more easier to see alignment of water used in terms of the cost of service, and in terms of you'll pay for your water on a variable rate as opposed to the higher fixed fees we had in the past. Service charges, watershed management fee, and capital maintenance fee together, those are basically staying flat when you add them all up together. Slight reduction in capital maintenance fee budget, slight increases in service charge. In the second year, you can see those all increased 5%, and that was the plan of the rate design. Whereas again, water sales will continue to fund kind of the bigger increases in the district's budget, the volumetric side on the top. Bottom line is that the overall rates are increasing by 22% in the first year, and then 15% in the second year in terms of the district's revenue from rates. The second category there, other revenues, these are what we call our non-rate revenues. We do have 4 or 5 categories there. Rents and royalties for about $2 million a year. Those are increasing due to a new license agreement we have for our rental properties up on Mount Tam for the communication site. So a lot of good work by Molly and Jared and the legal team last summer to help generate extra revenue here for the district. Permits and fees are pretty flat, as those don't change much from year to year depending on use. Fire flow fee is flat, exactly $4.5 million per year. So we don't expect to see any change there. Connection fees, we went a little bit more conservative this year, not knowing what the business and building cycle will look like going forward, but we dropped those this year. We'll begin taking a harder look at those over the next year in terms of our connection fee study. And so we may have revisions to that in our mid-cycle update. Grants, we do have good news on the grants. Our team has been working hard to secure grants. The ones you see here in the budget are primarily for the watershed and for pipeline replacements in underserved areas. And so we are recognizing $2 million in the first year of the budget and an additional $4.4 million in the second year of the budget. And then finally, other revenue, which is largely interest earnings and some miscellaneous revenues. Those are increasing as well, 49% in the first year, almost entirely due to the better interest rate environment for us. So as we're making on our cash portfolio, we're expecting that to come down a little bit in the second year, although nobody really can predict where rates will go. But to be conservative, we are recognizing the increase in the first year and starting to wind that down towards a more normal rate environment in that second year of the budget.
Where does the $6.5 million grant that was provided for the underprivileged Communities, where does that fit into this?
So that's captured there in the grants. That's the majority of those two grant items
So
are
it's spread
exactly
over
that.
2 years.
It's spread over, exactly, spread over 2 years. Exactly. So bottom line, again, these will line up with the expenditures. Our district revenue is increasing by 23% in the first year and then 16% in the second year. And again, kind of more a visual representation of that. You can see again the pie there. 60% of the expected revenue will come from variable water sales, while service charge, capital maintenance fee will be combined. About another 30%. And just as a reminder, watershed management fee there in the green towards the bottom, that is also now a variable fee based on usage, and so it's no longer a fixed fee. Fire flow fees are collected on the tax roll. Those will stay the same at 4.5%, and then other revenues make up about 4% of our overall revenue sources. So we talked about inflation, and I'll run through these relatively quickly because I know the board has seen these a few times, but these really were, the big ticket items in terms of what you'll see in the operating summaries. Double digit across the board, in some cases, closer to double over the last couple of years. So purchased water from Sonoma, we're expecting about a 10% per year increase over the next 4 years. Welded steel pipe, we continue to see in each bidding cycle, increase compared to the prior year. And when you average it out over the last 3 years, it was 17% per year. Water meters, again, just kind of the basic infrastructure that we put in each customer's property. Prices are up for over 90% just for the basic analog meters there, not even counting anything in terms of new technology, just basic analog meters. Paving contracts, those are, again, we just talked about that, but those have risen over 100% for paving projects since 2020. And that's largely in part due to local jurisdiction requirements. Insurance premiums, we'll hear again more from this next week, but over 50% since 2021, our premiums have gone up, largely due to just general risk here in California of being near the wildfire danger, and then also just overall litigation trends in California are not in our favor. So we're seeing over a 50% increase there. And then finally, water treatment chemicals, even though we're part of a regional consortium, so we get kind of a larger, purchasing power there. Nonetheless, we still saw a 42% increase in unit costs in the last cycle, and that was on top of a 20% increase in the cycle before. So these are some of our larger items in the budget. And again, each of those are well into the double digits, if not closer to doubling over the last couple of years.
Before you leave these,
Mhm.
Have you thought about a strategy to address some of this? For instance, insurance, we could lengthen that, increase our deductibles and so forth. The other ones all appear to fall to the same thing, except perhaps paving, but even then we could extend the contracts longer. Now they're going to want, some kind of inflation for that issue, but for the other ones, we could purchase more steel pipe, for instance. I don't know what our capacity is with respect to the yard over by Target, if that's all full, or if that's something we could, the storage looks a little haphazard to me out there. So I could envision a more organized storage, racks or something instead of just kind of being there. But it's obviously more capital upfront, but it provides benefit long-term. I don't know about the chemicals. I don't know if they'll sign a contract that's longer than X. But it seems to me that we should be thinking about some of this strategically as to what we can do to address these issues, instead of just going back and saying, well, the steel pipe's going up 70% per year. Just if we buy 2 years, then we cut 17% off. 5 years, we cut more, and so forth.
It's a good idea, Director Russell. We've given it some thought. We should kind of take another look at it. Of course, mortar line steel pipe, you only want to let sit around for too long, that sort of thing. But regardless, I do think there's potential opportunities often on things like long chemical contracts. They do have escalators or openers built in, and yet they do want to keep the contract. So you may be in a better position. Some of these could be spikes, with the shortage. So you want to be careful you aren't buying high, but it is something we should and we will take a look at.
But, the same point is, I remember when Southwest hedged their fuel, and they basically blew through the entire fuel increase with their hedge. It's risky, I mean, but it's both ways, right? So you can't expect the contractor or the vendor to take all the risk, but you can share the risk and, come to potentially a mutual agreement. I think you could especially attack something like a 42% increase, but as you said, it may just be the, chlorine and caustic soda they're tied hand in hand. So when one goes up, the other goes down, and one goes up, the other one goes down. So one or the other, depending on the caustic soda demand in the world, affects the price of chlorine, which I presume is our major cost of chemicals, although the ferric chloride is pretty high too. So
I don't know that I'm a major fan of using our own internal ability to bet the markets on any inflation metric or arbitraging where prices might go in the future. But I would be a fan, I think, of what you were saying, Larry, of leveraging our partners like Aqua and others to potentially pool our purchasing to be able to maximize the impact. So if that's where you're going, I'm all in favor of it. I'm not sure that we're in the position to make the analytical risk of betting on where chemicals are going to go in the future, up or down.
Specifically, if I could, on chemicals, we do participate in a Bay Area consortium that goes out for bids, and that has brought kind of the individual burden down as well as group pricing. So that's kind of a creative thing. Some of these others would be a bit more difficult, to think of that concept, but we'll take a look at this.
I just also want to flag, we've talked about the paving costs. I mean, 100% increase is pretty substantial, and needing to sit down with some of the local cities to talk about that and to figure out how we can address that increase, which seems to be somewhat of a discretionary change in decision making. So let's make sure we come
Any
back.
progress on that, Ben? We talked about it over months, and a definitely willingness of county to look at that with us. And I think you're going to come back with some analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. Staff has been doing a fair amount of kind of foundational work on that, and including looking to bring on an expert to have data for when we go to the cities. Probably in the next month or so will be good timing for us to give an update to the board on where we are and kind of a proposed approach going forward on that.
Awesome. Thanks.
I'd recommend too, including board members in those, because eventually, while you may not recognize it yet, it's coming that you're going to need those people contacts in various cities for future.
Right.
So it's beneficial to the board, and it's also changes the perspective of those meetings. Now I know Tiburon just cuts to the chase and comes straight to me. They don't come to the district. So when they want something, they just call me and say, hey, can you get this for us? Belvedere is similar, but the most experience I've had is with Tiburon, and they always want something. And like I say, I don't think they've ever come to the district first. So, but to the extent it can help us, keep that in mind, that there may be a benefit there. It may escalate their response to bring in a city council member or whatever, may or may not.
And just to round up the discussion on kind of our cost drivers here. So I showed the percentage increases there on some of our bigger ticket items, and this is how it translates into dollars. The first couple items here, or the first two, are not necessarily inflation driven, but big dollar items in the budget. So water supply resiliency, in the first year alone, we're looking at a little over $5 million in new spending. That covers those short-term projects and the roadmap, as I talked about. I know Alicia will talk a little bit more about, as well as the reserve contributions. Capital projects in terms of, increasing our investments towards deferred maintenance and beginning to invest in our critical systems. It's another $3.7 million. The purchased water and treatment, that's where we start to see the inflation there. So $3.9 million when you take into account the 10% or so increase from Sonoma Water, as well as the chemical costs for treatment, as well as we are anticipating, over the longer term, purchasing more water as opposed to just relying on the bare minimum contractual amount. So combined there, that's nearly $4 million of an increase. the service enhancements that we talked about, in terms of targeted areas where we can invest in the district from the watershed BIFIP investments. We have a water efficiency enhancements and a couple extra positions. That's a little over $1 million. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we are beginning to rebuild our unrestricted reserve after having used it during the drought. Paving contracts we just discussed, that's another $2 million on top of the baseline. And then finally, insurance down there, again, another $1 million as we're catching up to 2 full cycles of insurance premium increases. So these are incorporated in the budget in the various programs in which they live. I know we went through a lot of the detail in the budget study session, but at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia, and she's going to walk us through some more detail on the capital program that's in the proposed budget.
Before we do that, a couple of things. Since I've been on the board, under the board I've been on, we've spent over $400 million on things. So I want to make sure everybody understands that this isn't coming out of the blue. This isn't something that wasn't done before. It was done before. For years and years and years, most of those years, it was 25 million a year towards capital. Then it got decreased, and I don't exactly remember why it got dropped to 20 from 25. But for one thing I kind of remember was there was a limit on what work the district could do physically with the plan of what they're doing in-house, which had an impact on that. The other thing is in Thursday's IJ, there was an article maybe this weekend that 25% of the folks in Marin County are below the budget, the required to maintain a current lifestyle. So I think we need to be very, very careful here about equity and affordability. It's easy to think because that number, as I recall, was 146,000. It's not a low number. It isn't like, 50 grand. It's at 146, they're below what's needed according to ABAG or whoever the source of that stuff was to provide adequate income to live in Marin. Obviously that's a choice, but it's still a fact of life too. So we need to keep that in mind in our moving forward here.
And on that, we are following the board direction as we went through the rate process and being very intentional in communicating and reaching out to ensure folks understand that we do have a low income program that's quite generous, and trying to do perhaps a better job or a very good job to ensure that the folks that need to understand about the program do get that message.
Unfortunately,
Yeah, Larry, I'm curious about what you're saying there, because I do believe that we have one of the most generous and most thoughtful programs for affordability for low income people here. So you're saying you believe that we should do more? Because I think that's interesting if that's what you're saying.
Jed, the problem I see is, I was taken aback by the article that 25%. That's a pretty big number. I don't think our program approaches anywhere near that level of participation. And I think the reason for that is that many of the folks that would qualify live in multiple family housing where they don't physically see the water bill. So, and I don't know how that works. I don't even know if they can apply for this type of thing.
You're correct, Director Russell. The program is really for single family homes, basically customers that have the meter. And if you're in, for example, an apartment unit where you don't get a water bill, it goes to the apartment owner that presumably is a pass through. That's not built into our program.
And that is something that I do think that we should follow up on. That did come from one of my constituents. I know Molly, we connected about it. The idea that some of these multi-unit buildings are not able to provide the assistance and affordability for some of their individuals who are doing great work. So I think that would be absolutely worthy of pursuing how we can dig deeper into individual use beyond just the meter. But the vast majority of the rate increase obviously is not going to impact these people. The vast majority of the rate increase is going to impact massive users of water in single family houses.
Yeah, I just want to echo this too. This is not an issue of new concern to us. We've talked about affordability all along through the rate setting process, and that it's an issue that I think we all take really seriously. And various different ways that we approach the rate setting process made it so that the lower consumers of water saw a lower increase in rates than, as Jed is alluding to, the higher water use users. And so that was part of a number of different things that we did to be sensitive to the fact that we wanted to do as little as rate increases we possibly could across the board. Everything we did, we had to do in order to make sure that we have a reliable district that can deliver water and be prepared for a future where we're looking at greater droughts and climate change. So we did what I believe we had to do to catch up on our maintenance, that we've had great presentations that show the backlog of things that we need to do to make sure our district is sound. But we also did what we could with the way we approach the rate setting in order to reduce the impact as much as we could on the lower consumers of water and our lower income customers. So we have a great program. It can't reach out maybe as much as we want to people who live in apartments who don't actually see their water bill. That is a challenge. And if there's something that we can do to address that, then I think that's a great thing for us to explore.
The new piece of information, though, is the IJ article about the 25%. That's a number I have never seen before.
It actually doesn't surprise me. I feel like we've been hearing that for years about how expensive it is to live here. Our staff, the vast majority, do not live in our district because it is so expensive to live here. So it doesn't surprise me at all. Affordability in this county is really a challenge, and we're trying to do what little we can to contribute to that challenge. We're doing being as effective with our water and the costs in our district as we can be. But it doesn't surprise me. And if we can figure out ways to go after more grant funding to keep our costs down, to bring more revenue in, these are the things that we're doing to be responsive to the challenges that are going to continue to face our county and how expensive it is to live here.
And the good news is that affordability is not going to be as big an issue for our rate increase for lower income people than it is probably for either higher income people or people are using significant outdoor irrigation. I mean, that's where the money and dollars are being spent, that the rate increase is going to impact. So any argument about affordability is about affordability for really, in the end, outdoor irrigation use. That's the majority of where the problem is going to happen. And that would, I would imagine, if you do the numbers, would not be where the lower income folks are.
Maybe one more dimension to this really important discussion. We, I think, rightly pay a lot of attention to the impacts of higher rates on lower income groups. But at the same time, we should keep in mind the impacts of severe infrastructure deterioration and even drought on those same groups. They tend to actually suffer more when we're under severe drought. As all of you know, I like to read about the 76-77 drought. And one of the things I noted in that book was that at that time, prisoners in San Quentin were not allowed to shower for 6 months. Imagine that. So by investing in our infrastructure, we can actually provide benefits as well to those lower income groups.
Well said.
Good evening, directors. Alicia Irish, engineering manager. This evening, I'll be reviewing the district's proposed budget for fiscal years 23-24 and 24-25. First, we'll be going over our budget development process, then going into some details on our 2-year capital budget summary, and then finally discussing some next steps. First, to get into our process overview. Over the past 6 months, staff has been coming to the board to discuss the district's capital improvement program, which consists of the 2-year CIP budget as well as the 5-year CIP plan. This year's budget process included baseline funding plus enhanced funding for water supply, deferred maintenance projects, as well as service enhancements. The baseline CIP budget is developed by the district's capital steering committee. This is a cross-departmental team across every division at the district that meets regularly to discuss long-term planning and emerging project needs. And we also have grant funding that's been mentioned previously by Brett, and that's another critical component of our capital improvement plan. Staff actively pursue all opportunities to align grant funding with the district's upcoming needs. And this year's budget includes grants for both pipeline replacement projects as well as in watershed improvements. Some of the components that are included in the capital improvement program are the baseline budget, as well as enhancement funding going towards water supply, our deferred maintenance backlog reduction, which is a phased-in process over a 4-year planning period, system improvements, and enhanced funding dedicated to our watershed in our BIFIT program. And finally, we also have grant funding. To give a breakdown of our total budget by component, this is a 2-year budget that's over $82 million. There's close to $33 million allocated in fiscal year 24 and $49.5 million allocated in fiscal year 25. The majority of this funding is going towards our baseline budget. And then we also have enhanced funding going towards the 4 categories that I've mentioned: water supply, backlog projects, system improvements, and service enhancements. This table here shows our proposed baseline capital budget. The capital budget, or the baseline budget, excuse me, includes funding from our capital maintenance fee, rate revenue, connection fees, fire flow fee, grant funding, as well as interest. And you can see how the budget is broken down across our 6 various asset class categories, with the largest category being our pipeline replacements. And then our next largest category is our storage tanks. The majority of this baseline funding is going towards our Pine Mountain Tunnel tank replacement project. This is a project that will install 2 million gallon tanks on our watershed and will allow us to decommission our existing Pine Mountain Tunnel. This is a $25 million project that will take place over the next 5 years. It really is a legacy project that's been decades in the making. We also have over $4 million each year dedicated to our watershed, and the remainder of the funding is going across the 3 asset class categories of our pump stations, treatment plants, as well as system improvements. Now, to give an overview of some of our enhanced funding, this table here shows our preliminary funding schedule for our water supply capital investments over the next 4 years. In this next 2-year budget cycle, we have over $11 million dedicated to these 3 main projects. The first being the Phoenix to Bontempi connection project, the Sulahooley electrification project, and then finally $5.75 million dedicated over the next 2 years towards our longer term projects from our roadmap implementation. That's a result of our strategic water supply assessment. Just to give a reminder on these 2 projects, the Phoenix Bontempi connection project is a project that will install new infrastructure to pump water up from Phoenix Lake to Bontempi Reservoir. This will allow for improved operational efficiency and more frequent use of this water without the intensive system modifications that are required today. The total project cost for this is estimated at $5.2 million. The Sulahooley electrification project will bring consistent power to Sulahooley Reservoir and allow the district improved operability and flexibility of the storage facility. The total estimated project cost for this is $7.2 million. This table here shows an overview of our enhanced funding dedicated towards our deferred backlog reduction. This funding is distributed across our 6 asset class categories. And as we've presented to the board previously, the $24 million is needed on an annual basis to stabilize our aging infrastructure and stabilize our backlog. During the rate setting process, the board settled upon a phased-in approach, whereas by the end of year 4, we will have over half of this amount dedicated. In fiscal year 24, there's $3.1 million allocated, and this number more than doubles to $6.6 million in fiscal year 25.
What do you mean by more than half? What are you talking about?
I'm referring to the $24 million annual amount that would be needed to stabilize the backlog across all of our asset classes.
And what does it mean more than half?
In fiscal year 27, we'll have $14.5 million going towards this deferred maintenance on an annual basis. So more than half, more than 12.
That's what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, at that time.
At that time, correct. So we'll be ramping up from $3.1 million in fiscal year 24 to 6.6 in fiscal year 25. And then really getting a significant increase in this enhanced funding in fiscal years 26 and 27, going to $10.4 million and $14.6 million.
And you're confident that there's enough staff in the district to address that?
I would say it's a very good question in terms of the rate of ramp up and the capacity to deliver. And it's something Crystal and I talk about all the time. For example, we recently brought on 2 engineers. We're, I believe, now at full staffing in the engineering group, and we're looking at some potential opportunities for position changes that we're going to be bringing to the board. For example, we used to have a dedicated real property staff person that now we're using someone from the outside, and it seems to be going well at a lower cost. So that position potentially could convert to an engineer or somewhere to support the capital program. There's a couple other similar positions we're looking at. We'll discuss further with the board. And in addition, we're looking at the right balance for this agency, as well as what's in front of us, leveraging our staff with consultants, trying to strike the right balance. And we'll be talking to the board as well about that. I do want to say I am very clear, as the entire staff is, in terms of the commitment we've made to the board and public in terms of moving these projects forward. And we're committed to make that happen.
And does this include the district's overhead markup on these projects? There's like a 30% that we put into the costs.
These funds do include that overhead.
So there's kind of a return that maybe isn't reflected here, huh? Because that goes back to pay for operating costs of the district, that 30%.
So what I would say on that, when you bring operating and capital together, the capital budget here includes the funding would need for staff time, right? But on the operating side, we have not increased our, charge back until we decided this is going to be in-house staff or whatever it may be. So we will include that when we go to make staffing adjustments, but for now we're flatlining our return back from the capital fund.
Okay, thanks.
And for right now, we're just approving the 24-25 budget. I mean, I think that 26 and 27 is the plan and an outlook, and our strategic planning will look for that. But I think tonight we're looking at first 2 years, right?
That's correct. Yeah, tonight we're asking the board to adopt the 2-year budget for fiscal years 24 and 25.
And any issues with that, Larry, these 2 years?
Let's let it go forward. We'll talk more.
Okay.
So this enhanced funding going towards the deferred maintenance projects really gives us a framework to take on projects that have been identified for years that we've been unable to get to. So there are projects that have been long identified that are identified in the budget book, and those projects will be solely funded through the backlog maintenance funding. Perfect segue. Here are some examples of those projects. In the pipeline asset class, we have the Paradise Drive project, which is a project that will replace a half mile of 100-year-old cast iron pipe in downtown Tiburon. We also have the Paloma Granada project, which is a cast iron replacement project in East Corn Madera. And this project will replace over a mile of increasingly leaking cast iron pipe that was installed in the 1950s and 60s. And finally, in the pipeline asset class, we have the design for the North Marin Line. And the North Marin Line pipeline replacement project goes from the bottom of Kent Lake along Sir Francis Drake all the way to the Smith Saddle tanks. In our pump stations and storage tanks, we have funding dedicated towards the Tokoloma Pump Station Upgrade Project. The $1 million that will be supplemented towards the Tokoloma project will allow us to holistically complete this project and this upgrade. We also have $500,000 in fiscal year 24 to recoat the Wolfback Ridge tanks in the hills of Sausalito, as well as $1 million in fiscal year 25 going towards the replacement of the Hind tanks, which are 2 redwood tanks in the hills of San Rafael. Additionally, we have other projects such as the replacement of the roof at the San Geronimo treatment plant, as well as the San Clemente System Improvement Project.
I question the description of those as backlog. I mean, let's talk about the pipelines for a minute. What I recall is that we categorize pipelines by need for replacement. So while it's probably not unfair to call them backlog, in reality, the flip of it's true that they didn't make the grade to be put in sooner. They didn't make
Correct.
Criterion.
What this will allow us to do is to stabilize, and I'll have some charts showing the effect of the rehab rates for the pipelines. But what this will allow us to do is begin to stabilize that backlog. And if we did not have this enhanced funding, we would not be able to perform these projects because the baseline funding has other equally critical projects that have been identified in that baseline category.
Well, to that end, I'll ask the question again, which I've been asking routinely for 18 years, which is, it seems to me that if 100-year-old cast iron is the problem, we should be attacking the 100-year-old cast iron pipes. And the answer I get is, as I recall, is that that's what we're doing. We're getting to them. So I find it interesting that all of a sudden Paradise Drive's pipe has made that cut, although it didn't before. So, you know, it could just be a judgment call. I don't know. But I just find it interesting that you feel this urgency that wasn't felt for 17 years of my 18 years on the board, as I recall.
Yeah, it's an interesting, there's a lot of ways to look at it. One way, you know, is you look at the amount of infrastructure we have, maybe $2 billion replacement value, expected life 70 years, maybe on average. And this, some people call it kind of a pig in a python that's just coming and going to hit. And you do want to and need to get ahead of it if you can, and not leave it, you know, for the big devastating surprise that can occur. That said, certainly every piece of infrastructure that we work on is not based on the estimates that we're looking at in a big picture. They're looked at discretely. And in terms of the prioritization, I'd say often it's based upon how much resources you have. So I do think it's fair to say in the past at times there's been some pretty significant needs that just don't get met, or missed opportunities. For example, we've had to pass in the last few years on very old pipe that need to be replaced, and the city's doing paving, but we just say we just don't have the revenue to do it. And then you get a moratorium, and the costs when you do absolutely need to do it are higher than if you had done it at that opportunity. So I agree and appreciate that perspective, but I do think we do have significant needs and opportunities, and I think this is an ambitious program. I do think it's a right, appropriate one to really address some of these needs and opportunities in front of us.
Yeah, I'm not pushing back yet. But for instance, something like the San Geronimo treatment plant roof replacement is a project that's been asked for since I've been on the board, as I recall.
Right.
I mean, as I recall, there's buckets when it rains
That's correct.
inside of the building. But I'm wondering if maybe we should not necessarily change this, but rethink how it's paid for. When Bihar was on the board, he pushed very hard for pay-as-you-go. And that's kind of the direction we went. But I could also see, I mean, the sum of all these things is 30 million or some number like that. That's kind of a bite-sized bond. You could have a special capitalized bond for dealing with these kinds of delayed or backlog, whatever you want to call them, ungotten to projects. So it's something to think about. I think it's okay direction we're on. It's just pricey for the demand, on the user. Whereas maybe, and I've been one pushing for pay as you go too. So, but something like the San Geronimo has a long-term, I mean, that's a 50-year event.
Right.
So it isn't something that you do it this year, but you benefit for 50 years afterwards or longer. So, maybe, and I'm not fighting, I'm just discussing. We should think a little bit about how these should be put into tables to say we should try to put them in this group to do a capitalization. For instance, when my wife was president of the school board in Reed Union, they did a $39 million bond to address exactly these kinds of issues, dry rot in the roof and this kind of thing. And they did the 3 schools in Tiburon at one pop and got them all. And, maybe there's something there to think about how to, especially after 24, 25, to think about how, because I mean, you didn't talk about it, but those are big jumps, big bites out of the capital improvement budget. And
if I could respond briefly on the bonding issue, we did talk to the board about going forward in the next 4 years, looking at some of these large generational projects. And Alicia noted on pipelines, North Marin Line, we're proceeding with the design. The actual construction of that is a very significant cost. I know 20+ million, and there's a number of projects, right? Smith Saddle tanks, we've identified a handful that we did tell the board, and we will come back to you looking at what 1 or 2 large capital projects we want to bond fund in the near term. Understanding, of course, that we do want to reserve a significant portion of our bonding capacity for big water supply projects that may be in our future.
I mean, I'm curious, Larry, your line of questioning. We've been talking about this backlog of projects for months now. We've talked about, as Ben said, the enormous bubble of infrastructure breakdown that we're trying to recover from years of lack of investment. I've seen the Tokoloma pump station technology that we're buying parts from eBay because they can't be readily found on the market, and the Wolfback Ridge tanks above Sausalito, which I went to with Crystal and others, which are falling apart, and the Paradise Drive effort in your area that is clearly needed. So I'm just confused about your line of questioning. You're saying we're not doing enough, or we should do less?
well, what I'm trying to say is this, not less, I'm not proposing that, but when I started on the board in 2004, the backlog, or whatever you want to call it, was $400 million. We spent $400 million, and it's still $400 million. So what I'm really talking about is I'm not sure we're characterizing the things right. I don't really understand how you can have a need of 400 million, spend 400 million and still have 400 million to go. It's not impossible, obviously. I just think it's kind of mischaracterizing the situation. Maybe the first $400 million number was wrong. I don't know. Maybe it was 800 million in 2004, but I don't understand how you spend 400 million and you're still where you started. I mean, you're not where you started. We did work, but the dollars stay the same. And I just don't get that. You know, it seems to me we're not characterizing it properly somewhere along the way. And I mean, this is a conversation I've had 40 times in the district. This is not new. Exactly the same issue. And I find it frustrating that we keep plowing the money in and the need keeps up with us.
But I think this is, I mean, it's been 18 years that you've been on the board, Larry. So, but I think the next slide actually gets at the point, which maybe we could allow the presentation to keep going, which is this. To me, this is one of the most important graphics that's put up here to explain what it is we're doing and why we are raising rates, is because we need to change the trajectory. And maybe, you know, where we were at was at a line where we were staying steady. And so it was 400 million when you joined and 400 million now. The 400 million back 18 years ago, you know, is a different number.
Yes.
But anywho, you know, the point being is that we actually, I think the important thing is that we've taken the time to look at where we were at in our current system and to make sure that 18 years from now, we have a different conversation, that we're not, and I have faith that we have looked at this, because we have raised this issue now very strongly, I think, to get a handle on this, because this is about making sure we're leaving the system in the condition that it should be in for future generations. And we're dealing with the problem now so that it doesn't get worse. And if we're not doing that, then I don't feel like we would be doing our job. Myself, I'll just say for myself. And so that's where I look at our enhanced funding is hardly, you know, we are still looking, even with our enhanced funding, we are still going out decades before we actually maybe get to the point where the number is stabilizing. And so I don't think I don't think it'd be fair to say that we're being overly aggressive. Maybe there are definitely people who'd be like, you should be getting more aggressive. I think that would have cost impacts that would be too extreme. So this graphic has driven my decision making about what we are doing and the investments that we're making now, so that we can change the course, so that 18 years from now, we're not staring at the same problem.
And that's the whole point of what I'm saying. I'm not sure that that's true. Okay. I think that same discussion would have been had in 2004 before we spent the 400 million. And what I'm worried about is we're sort of either in a Sisyphean loop, or it's just a track that, you know, we don't seem to be gaining on it. And I really don't like the title of this one. I don't like the term past due. I don't think that's appropriate. As we've discussed numerous times, these are what I would call tummy rubbing numbers, that they're based on industry averages as opposed to our situation. And when a tank needs to be painted, it needs to be painted. It doesn't matter if it's 25 years or 45 years or 10 years. But to just say that this curve in particular is one that's based on these industry guidelines, or whatever you want to call them, which don't actually exist. They're more like rules of thumb, if even that may be overstating them. Now, remember, I do this for a living. Okay, this isn't just a job that I come to the board meeting. This is what I do for other water districts. And I've been involved with this my entire career, almost 47 years. And, you know, I'm just concerned of the characterization, because I don't think it really addresses the issue. For instance, redwood tanks. And we've discussed all this before. In the 70s, this district was still putting in redwood tanks. It was clearly not the state of the art. Everybody knew that. And yet the district did it. I think the same thing could be made, argument can be made about Smith Saddle. I think that was not a good choice, the steel tanks at that time. And so we need to really be careful, I think, of the choice of words, because like I said, what I'm concerned is we increase the spending and 20 years from now, this board is sitting, not this board, but a board is sitting with the same discussion that we're having today, which is somebody's going to say, hey, you know, we spent $400 million and we're still $400 million in the hole. Now, I don't know if that catches up, and this may not be the forum for the discussion, and I'm perfectly comfortable to stop talking about it. But that is the root of my concern. And like I said, I don't like the title of that slide, or the next two, I think.
So I think choice of words is important. And so when you say you see this slide as tummy rubbing, and I've heard you say that at other times. So you're, but what I hear you saying, and you're obviously much more of an expert than I am, that the data that the staff is showing us is tummy rubbing and not really helpful or valuable for us to make decisions. Whereas I think what Monty heard was, what I heard Monty say was that this is an important slide, and it's an important one for me as well as the others that we've been looking at for 6 months. But I think what you're saying is that you don't think the staff is providing you with data that's accurate. It's just more like tummy rubbing.
If I could, I think both Director Russell and Director Schmidt are accurate in the sense of, I believe this is a good slide in terms of the big picture, which you have to use assumptions and estimates on where you are based on some standards and industry practices, manufacturer recommendations, and experience. At the same time, it doesn't mean necessarily that each and every tank certainly needs to be recoded at a prescribed period, which is why before we recode a tank, we certainly do an inspection and confirm. And some tanks do not require it. Some, on the other hand, other tanks may require a more frequent recoding based on the nature of the environment they're in. So I do think it's not precise on individual pieces of infrastructure. Personally, I do believe it's a very valuable tool, and I applaud engineering staff for developing this to help look at the bigger picture and help our planning financially and otherwise.
Yeah, and no doubt we're not going to be able to look out to 2060 to make predictions. So, really, we're concerned about the first few years here.
Yeah, and my problem isn't with the graph, it's with the title. So that's where the issue is from my end.
I understand that, and we do need to refine. I appreciate that comment.
I'd like to move on as well. I just want to say, I think you bring up a very good point about, are we going to be putting ourselves in a better spot? Because to President Schmidt's point, that's where we need to be. That's the entire reason for doing this. But I have faith that the plan going into effect right now is getting us to a better spot. And also things change, and we have to constantly keep evolving and investing to make sure that we keep up, so we can have a water district that's going to be responsible for the following generations. So
The kind of, we do have to move on. I had meant to bring up the other point, as you're well aware of. For example, a mile of pipe used to cost us $1 million. Now it's $2+ million. Some places are saying it's 3. So, right, if you maintain a baseline of expenditures, you aren't capturing the additional cost, and how much you can invest on goes down.
And that is exactly the point I'm trying to make, Ben, that the basis from which we're projecting is wrong. In other words, there's no way in my thinking that we could have been $400 million needed to be spent. We spent $400 million and we still got $400 million to spend. It just doesn't make sense unless our projections or our model is wrong. In other words, the spreadsheet, I mean, I'm sure you guys have, maybe you've seen it, but I doubt you have. There are detailed spreadsheets as a result of these kinds of discussions, laying out exactly the thought process of when pipelines need to be replaced and how they get characterized, and cast iron versus wire wound concrete pipe and so forth. And like I say, the concept is fine, but I think we need to be careful about, because I don't think you guys really have the ability to project into the future at all. In the sense, you just don't have the background you have to totally depend on staff. And I'm not saying staff's wrong. It's just that there's something wrong with the system because you can't have a $400 million problem, spend $400 million and still have $400 million to spend. It just doesn't make sense.
But
So are
Larry,
you
it's
saying that we
true.
should have spent less than 400 million in the past?
I'm sorry?
Are you saying we should have spent less than 400 million?
No,
in
not
the
at all.
past?
What I'm saying is, I think that optimistic goals like Monty's may not be met. That's what I'm trying to predict for you, is that it's the problem as we're approaching it, in my opinion, isn't being addressed by the model we're using. So I don't know what the answer is, and I don't have a better way of dealing with this at the moment, but I'm telling you that, just listen to my words. We have a $400 million problem in 2004. We spent $400 million and we still have a $400 million problem. How can that be? Unless we just made a bad prediction.
Larry, I completely agree with you that models never perform as well as we would like. And there are a number of always assumptions that go into the models that are ultimately not that reliable. But honestly, we've been looking at these slides for months now. I feel like they've been presented to us over and over again. And if we were, looking for alternatives to this, or a different model or a different way to think about what's needed to maintain our infrastructure, I feel like we would have already had those discussions. This seems like a tough time to be raising potentially a flawed model when we've been through this so many times. So I at this point, I'm feeling like nothing is going to be perfect, but I'm confident that staff is doing their best, and I'm willing to take this as the best analysis.
I don't disagree with your analysis of the staff's doing their best. I agree 100%. I think if you will think back, I have been harping on this issue over and over and over again.
I haven't heard you say that the staff had a flawed model before.
What I said, Jed, was this, that it is not a good model or a good approach to use industry averages as the establishment for when things need to be done. That is a tool. It's not the end product. It's as simple as that. In other words,
So what would be the better tool for us to use? Help us.
as I have said, that, and Ben characterized it properly, the actual decision is made upon the conditions on the ground. That is the condition that needs to be addressed. It isn't, in my thinking, enough to say that, hey, the tank's 25 years since we coated it, it needs to be coated. No. This tank needs to be coated. This one can wait. And I think that's exactly what we've done. So again, I get, it isn't just semantics to me. I mean, this, like I said, this is what I advise water districts on all the time, how you're going to spend your money. And many much bigger water districts than this one. And, I think you've heard me say it, but it hasn't perhaps sunk in yet. And I'm not proposing a change in direction. It's just that I think these optimistic goals are fine. I just don't feel they're achievable. It's not so simple. And I don't know the solution. If I did, I would have put it up in the last 18 years. But I'm just telling you that I expect that 20 years from now, there'll be a discussion just like this one going, we've spent this amount of money and we got this left to do. And one thing to keep in mind is part of this recycles, that some things get worn out in the period of time that occurs in the planning effort. So, all of a sudden you think you're done with the pump station, but you just got to redo it. And, I do appreciate the fact that, buying parts off of eBay may be a pain in the butt, but, the important thing about doing the work is getting the work done, and whatever it takes is what it takes. It's easy. There are energy reasons to change things. I think the perfect example is the Castagna pump station. There are issues with those motors that are, I will say, insoluble with replacement of parts. You need to get in and attack the whole problem. But, you know, I bring it up more as food for thought than I'm not fighting. I'm not. I'm just trying to change expectations of what we'd like to have happen versus probably what's going to happen.
All
So-
right, I totally appreciate that, and I appreciate your perspective, and I have a hunch that you and I agree on most of the details of what would need to get done. It's not, you can't generalize and come up with all the answers. Every specific tank and pipe has its own story. But in the end, what I want to be associated with is an agency that is striving to be the best, that does not just use tape and Band-Aids and paper clips to keep it together, but that we can really strive to be the best in class and be leaders and serve our people well.
So if I may,
Of course.
we'll get back to these charts. So these are for financial planning purposes. And this enhanced funding will put us on an improved trajectory. We will be inspecting, for this slide in particular, each and every tank prior to declaring it to be recoded. Moving on to the pipeline asset class. This enhanced funding, even though it does still increase our backlog, it does put us on an improved trajectory than if we were to not have this backlog. And that's largely due to the fact that of the 900 miles of pipe that we have in our system, close to a third of it was installed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. 190 miles of cast iron itself was installed in 1950s and 1960s alone. So we do know that there is a bubble, as you can see in this chart, that will need to be replaced in the future. And just moving quickly to the pump stations. Again, this enhanced funding will allow us to completely upgrade the Tokoloma pump station, which is a critical pump station in our system. If it were not for this pump station, we would not be able to treat the water from Suluhuli and Nicasio lakes. Now moving on to another category of enhanced funding for system improvements. In fiscal year 24, there's $500,000 allocated for system improvements and just under $4 million allocated in fiscal year 25. And this is namely going towards our ERP replacement or the replacement of the SAP software that's been in use in the district for over 20 years. Over this next first phase, we will be initiating an options review and issuing an RFP with a go-live target date in fiscal year 27. And finally, getting towards our watershed enhanced funding, this $500,000 a year will allow for an annual additional 235 acres or a 17% increase towards achieving these plans' goals. Now to get into some more granular detail on the 2-year CIP summary. So just quickly showing these numbers again. This shows the total CIP budget for fiscal years 24 and 25 distributed across all 6 of our asset class categories. Within each category, there are various fund centers. One of the fund centers is our cathodic protection and tank recoding, which is located in the storage tank asset class. And this fund center maintains our corrosion protection, extending the life of our pipelines, our steel pipelines, and our steel tanks. There's $400,000 of baseline funding allocated towards this program each fiscal year, with an additional $500,000 of backlog funding going towards the Wolfback Ridge Tanks Recoding project. For our pipeline asset class, in our capital program, we have $7 million allocated in fiscal year 24 and $10.4 million allocated in fiscal year 25. This will allow us to replace 6 miles of distribution pipeline. And this includes $1.5 million of backlog funding in fiscal year 24 and $3.6 million in fiscal year 25. These backlog projects are the ones that I previously mentioned: Paradise Drive in Tiburon, a portion of the East Corn Madera cast iron pipeline replacement project, as well as the North Marin Line design. We also have future projects that have been identified to take place in years 3 and 4 to be used from the deferred backlog funding, such as Miracle Mile in San Rafael, Bolinas Road in Fairfax, and the Freitas Parkway valve replacement project. Another component of our pipeline asset class is our fire flow improvement program. In this program, there's $4.5 million allocated each year towards construction projects that have been pre-identified from our fire chiefs. And these largely include 4- and 6-inch cast iron pipeline replacement projects. And there's also $150,000 allocated annually for discretionary funds. And these are largely for the addition of fire hydrants in areas that have been identified by the fire chiefs where the spacing is currently too far apart. For our treatment plants, we have $24 million allocated in fiscal year 24 and $1.6 million allocated in fiscal year 25. The two large projects for the treatment plant category include the San Geronimo roof replacement project, as well as the Bontempi backwash line pipeline replacement project. There's $500,000 allocated each year for backlog funding. And in fiscal year 24, this will go to a portion of the San Geronimo roof replacement project. And then in fiscal year 25, this will be the first of a 3-year project to upgrade the motor control centers and provide PLC upgrades to each treatment plant. In our reservoir and dams, which is in the watershed asset class category, we have $1.5 million allocated in fiscal year 24 and $400,000 allocated in fiscal year 25. Of this funding, $1.2 million is going towards spillway repairs and other required assessments as part of the required condition assessments that we're in phase 2 of currently. And the remainder of the funding is going towards other valve repairs and replacements. For our storage tanks, we have $4.8 million in fiscal year 24 and $6.5 million in fiscal year 25. The large majority of this baseline funding is going towards our Pine Mountain Tunnel project. In August, we'll be initiating the start of construction of this project and performing the site work in this construction season. This project is scheduled to last for 5 years, at which point the existing Pine Mountain Tunnel will be decommissioned. And the $1 million of backlog funding in fiscal year 25 will aid in the replacement of the Hein Redwood tanks, which are located in San Rafael. In our pump station asset class category, we have $2.3 million allocated in fiscal year 24 and over $9.5 million allocated in fiscal year 25. The two main baseline projects in the pump station asset class are the Tokoloma pump station upgrade, as well as the phase 2 of the Cassania pump station to allow us to optimize the water that we receive from Sonoma. In this pump station fund center, we also have over $6 million allocated for the water supply projects of the Phoenix Bontempi connection and the Suluhuli electrification project. In our program management fund center, we have a variety of projects, such as our asset management and water system master plans, our San Clemente system improvement project, which is a project that will create a new pressure zone for San Clemente tank, which will reduce the demand from the Ross Valley pressure zone and improve the turnover of the San Clemente tank. There's also funding in this fund center for IT projects and the ERP replacement, as well as the planning and pre-design of the roadmap implementation at $5.75 million across the 2 fiscal years. In our watershed, we have $3.3 million in fiscal year 24 and just under $5 million in fiscal year 25. And this is going towards our BIFIP, or Fire and Fuels Management Program, our roads and trails, with $250,000 in backlog funding going directly towards the improvement of Cataract Trail and other various trails in the watershed. And there's also funding allocated towards culvert and landslide repairs. And finally, we have other small projects that are distributed across various asset class categories, such as control systems and valves, meter replacements, building and ground improvements, and capital equipment purchases. For these small projects, we have just under $2 million allocated for each fiscal year. Just to give a summary of our capital improvement program, we have funding that includes both baseline and enhancement funding. And this funding is distributed across all asset classes and categories. And these projects were largely prioritized by the Capital Steering Committee. And these projects address critical investments that are needed to continue to maintain our natural resources while delivering high quality water. One of the main next steps for our capital improvement program is to come back to the board at a later date with a long-term capital plan showing both a 10-year and 30-year timeline horizon. Now I'll be passing this back off to Brett to give a budget recap.
Thank you, Alicia. And so as I mentioned, as Alicia detailed quite a bit, the budget is increasing by 22% in fiscal 24, an additional 15% in fiscal 25. The reasons for those increases have been discussed here tonight, as well as through the rate process, inflation, some enhanced funding for operating activities, water supply resiliency, including short-term projects, longer-term planning, reserves. We talked about the capital projects in depth there and the need to address deferred maintenance and why we're phasing that in over the 4 years. Also just reserve replenishment for unrestricted reserves as we recover from the drought. And then also enhanced service levels for watershed and water efficiency. And on those 2 points, I have another couple slides here on the last bullet point there, service levels for watershed and water efficiency. Over the past couple board meetings and the past couple weeks, there has been an interest in exploring any ways that we can provide additional funding for either conservation, and we also call that water efficiency, or watershed. And, you know, as we've talked about many times here today, that the budget's a plan here in the public sector. You know, the budget is a representation of trade-offs. And so as we talk through this kind of the decisions on whether to trade off funding for conservation or for watershed, I wanted to be clear one more time about what's actually in the proposed budget as it stands for those two areas. So within conservation, and we talked about this a little bit more in the budget study session and the prior board meetings, but there are three primary areas there in conservation that are all intended to preserve the district's water supply. Part of that's in community engagement, providing incentives to change behavior, and then enforcing regulations as needed. The budget that we have here today proposed does include $275,000 in enhanced funding for this effort for a conservation program. And that's intended to supplement current efforts for outreach and marketing to make sure we are maximizing our participation levels. It also provides funding for improved analytics on the data side, more targeted advertising programs, training on gray water. And then in the second year, we have a placeholder there for increased rebate incentives after we wrap up the water conservation element planning process. So that will be in the second year, there is increased conservation rebate incentives. In addition to district funds here, rate funds, we have been notified that we've been awarded a $700,000 grant that we can spend over the next 3 years. We do not have all the details yet. That's coming through Sonoma Water. But once we get those options, we will find a way to maximize those funds as well for district customers and for the district overall. So in the intent of clarity here, the overall budget is $2.6 million for conservation. And we are recommending an increase or included an increase of $275,000 in the first year, in addition to the grant that's not in the budget, but will be recognized once we have all the details.
And we're thinking like, you mean like water efficiency and demand and more than conservation, right? That term has a different impact.
Water efficiency, demand management, conservation, I think they all go through our water efficiency program here. And I think they try to get a balance in all three of those areas, as it says in the beginning: community engagement, incentives.
More about definition. And have you put into your recommendations our matching opportunities with that grant funding for Sonoma I think it's about turf, right?
So this slide is just intended to show what's in the current budget that we've reviewed, and similar the next slide on watershed. And then we have a couple follow-on slides that look at for the board to consider if we wanted to enhance beyond what is in the current budget. So this is what's in the current budget, and similar with the next slide on watershed.
For clarification on this, so fiscal year 23 compared to fiscal year 24, we're increasing this budget by 275,000 plus whatever the grant could potentially bring in.
Correct. Approximately maybe a third of the 700,000 is in the current budget. That's right.
Thank you.
And similarly for watershed, we've received discussions indicating interest in how we can increase funding there. So to clearly articulate what's in the proposed budget, we have the four primary programs there dedicated towards protecting our current local source of water supply. That's watershed protection and maintenance, vegetation and management, or natural resources, fisheries, and then our grants and legislation program. Within that, one we talk about a lot is our biodiversity, fire, fuels, and integrated plan, or our BIFIP. The current budget on there, and this is a mix between capital and operating, but the current budget there is 2.2 million. And when I say current, I should say the fiscal 23, so the prior year. We are recommending an increase based on board direction of $500,000 specifically for the BIFIP. So we'll increase that from 2.2 to 2.7. And that's about a 27% increase beginning next year. And then that will increase with inflation in future years. So it'll be dedicated just towards BIFIP activities. And as Alicia noticed, that would significantly increase our overall acreage covered by that program. Within the watershed capital, as there is a portion there within capital, we do have increased funding for deferred maintenance on watershed projects beginning in fiscal 25. And then if you look out for fiscal 26 and 27, which as Director Smith pointed out, are outside this budget process, but in the planning process still, that's when the larger dollars come in for the watershed, and that will essentially double our current capital investment in the watershed when we get to those 2 years. And then finally, as the grants and legislation program are here within the watershed, many current funding opportunities align well with our current work on the watershed. And so we do have grant funding program now for Lagunitas Creek fisheries restoration in the current budget.
Brett, that 2.2 current budget, does that include grant funding for the BIFIP?
That's the district's funding right now. We have been able to take advantage of grants in the past to supplement it, but this is our baseline district funding coming out of our rates is the 2.2 million.
Okay. And then briefly, the reasoning behind pushing deferred maintenance to the next fiscal year for the watershed?
Yeah, so that's one of those kind of trade-offs that we have with the budget process. And so I think, Alicia went through, some of the bigger projects in pipelines and some of our kind of traditional infrastructure. And we have that table there earlier on where the backlog funding is going. And so I think as we prioritized it, the best bang for our buck, as staff saw it, was to start with kind of the more traditional infrastructure and then weave in the other ones as the funding steps up, right? It starts for 3 million in the first year, then 6, then 9. So as the funding grows for backlog, and then we start to focus it on the watershed.
No, understood. That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so with those two kind of background slides in terms of conservation or water efficiency and watershed, again, the proposed budget incorporates our prioritization process and rate setting discussions we've had over the last 6 months. If we do decide to increase our funding in this budget for water efficiency or watershed, with the whole budget trade-off, that would require use of either one-time funds or reductions in other areas. We'd have to think about where we'd reduce in order to add to those areas. Some alternatives to consider would be on the water efficiency front, funding the local match portion of that Sonoma grant with any one-time savings we can identify, so that we're not, reducing the budget or kind of using in-kind contributions. We'd actually be generating some one-time savings elsewhere in the district and using that for our match. That's an option for us. We could also increase funding for incentives and rebates in the same fashion as we identify one-time savings over the next year or possibly 2. We could dedicate those one-time savings towards increasing funding available for incentives and rebates. Secondly, in the second category for watershed, 2 options for the board to consider here are accelerating the implementation of deferred maintenance projects, as Director Sampson just noticed, pointed out the deferred maintenance watershed projects are largely in the years 3 and year 4 in the budget here. So we can pull those forward and push some of the deferred pipeline replacement projects out. Or we can increase our BIFIP spending by an additional $500,000. So essentially doubling the increase from the current 500 to what would be a current $1 million by reducing the CIP in other areas. And Just to kind of provide a little background on this, the reason we need to kind of make sure we're being pretty targeted with these is because for 218 process and for general kind of separating operating capital, we can swap within some of these larger buckets, but we can't really kind of cross certain sides of the house. So these are kind of intended to show where the easiest maneuvers would be to maintain compliance with Prop 218 and to still meet the board's desires if needed.
When we say this one-time savings on the water efficiency, what we mean by that specifically is, as the board's aware, we have a number of vacancies that we've been holding until this point, and we're moving to fill positions. The way that typically goes, and we're seeing it now, it's highly unlikely. I think it's fair to say we will not have all the positions filled by July 1. The budget assumes full staffing. So we do expect, when we say one-time savings, because of those vacancies we had and the time to get them filled, we do expect we'll have this coming year some one-time savings that if the board chose to, we identified potentially water efficiency could be a place to consider putting them as a one-time.
So this is the final slide of the presentation, and this lays out essentially the options as we kind of move towards board action here. So option 1 for the board would be to adopt the budget as proposed, just kind of as originally presented. Option number 2 would be to adopt the budget with increased funding for either watershed and or water efficiency, and then also identifying the offsets here in terms of how we would keep the overall bottom line in place and between capital and operating in place. But we could identify funding and then the offsets here today. A third option would be to adopt the budget as proposed and then direct staff to return in September with additional funding options for watershed and conservation, and do it as a mid-year adjustment as we go through the process.
And the reason we identified September sometime in the fall is at that time we would have a better sense of how much money is there from these vacancy savings. That said, I do believe we have a pretty good handle on it, and it wouldn't be unreasonable necessarily to go with option 2 as described and anticipate those fundings will occur based on the current trajectory we're on in filling positions.
So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much. Okay, director's comments. I'll start to the right here.
Thank you very much for that, and for everyone who put a lot of time into it. I think it's a very well thought out plan, and I'm incredibly excited to support this because it's going to keep us moving forward in a direction from which I think we all have a mission to take on. You know, we've got a watershed that is in a lot of need of maintenance, as well as enhanced or accelerated work towards the wildfire portion of it. And we've got a very clear directive that we need additional water, and we need it as soon as we can get it to make sure we don't repeat what happened 2 years ago or 5 years ago or however many years ago off that. So I appreciate the effort to go into this because that's another big project, or both of those are really big projects in terms of everything else that's going on day to day. So no questions on the part that I have. And when we're ready, President Schmidt, to talk about the options, I don't know when you like to take comments on those. For options.
Might as well take them hand in hand.
Okay. Could you put the presentation back up? Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah.
It would just be the last slide, I believe, the one showing the options, or the second to last one. I think it had a little more detail. That would be good. Looking at the Sonoma Water Grant one-time savings in terms of using our money for that, it sounds like we're not really clear what that's really for yet. Is that a fair statement?
I haven't seen the detail yet in terms of what we can use it for.
Yeah, I don't believe we have the full detail. I do think it can be used to support incentives, augment incentives, or potentially go to other programs, but we don't yet have the full detail.
Okay, thank you. And then So it seems like allocating money for something we're not completely sure of makes more sense to hold it and then take a look at in September, whenever it's the most appropriate for staff to come back and say, these are the details, this is what can get us, and making that decision at that point for that one. And then are we taking a look at incentives and rebates in July at all? Or is that just going to be the turf replacement piece? The ordinance of?
Right. Thank you. Specifically, we are coming back on non-functional turf and gray water to talk about those, as well as potentially looking at a phase out of the programs that we've identified have kind of become fully utilized by our customers.
Okay. And then, sorry, I've got one more question on the BIFIT piece in terms of the additional spending, moving forward with that. You know, I get, maybe concern is probably too strong of a word, but I want to make sure that we're confident that we'd be able to spend this money in a timely manner. And if we're going to be increasing it by $1 million this year instead of 500,000, that's quite a bit more work. And I want to make sure we're comfortable with taking that workload on as opposed to just blanketly approving it.
I think we're comfortable if the board did want to go that direction, that we could get the work done.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely needed. And my guess is that you easily find somewhere to do that, just the managerial part of it. So thank you for that clarification. So I think President Schmidt, where I'm leaning on right now is adopt the budget as is, with the direction of staff to come back in September with these specific looks to say, we've got this identified savings through personnel vacancies. We'd like to look at these two options here to make sure we see where we're at. And I think we should be able to get started with the money we have in the budgets right now to get us to September, I hope. So that's my recommendation.
Great, thank you. Ranjit?
Yeah, first, thank you, Brett and Alicia, for another great presentation. I think, you started by outlining 4 goals for this budget to strengthen our water supply reliability, including effective demand management, ensuring a resilient watershed that is protected from degradation and wildfire, investing in aging infrastructure, and rebuilding reserves. I'm confident that the budget that you've laid out addresses these 4 priorities, and I do support it. Now, regarding the options that you've put forward for potentially increasing spending for watershed and or water efficiency, Ben, you've noted that you're fairly confident that there will be savings related to delayed hires, and that funding you've stated you're fairly confident is going to be available. I appreciate Director Sampson's sort of more measured approach to first determining how that additional funding is best spent before immediately committing to it. But I have to say, I like the signals of moving a little aggressively to say that we are going to, going with option 2 to say that we are going to increase funding for watershed and or water efficiency prior to fully understanding how those funds would be spent, because I do appreciate the signals it sends with respect to our commitments for both the watershed and for conservation, efficiency, demand management. So, but I think I would be comfortable with either of those options, just sort of stating my position for now.
Midstream clarification, if I could, because we are kind of this is some new concepts. The one-time savings and vacancies is proposed if the board wanted to consider it for the water efficiency or conservation enhancement. The watershed additional is more by moving up some capital projects that are in year 3 or 4, kind of swapping those with gray infrastructure projects. So it's keeping the CIP whole. It's just accelerating some of the work in the watershed. So that's not necessarily related. It's not related to the vacancy potential.
you mind if I just stop back in on that clarification? So these are two separate items then. So there's not enough money in the one-time savings to look at both of those.
Well, I would say more, it's on the watershed. It's just kind of an, for now, and I think elegant approach that Brett came up with to, in these first 2 years, if the board wanted to increase the watershed expenditure, keeping the CIP whole as is and not moving kind of operating dollars into the CIP, which is different. So we have operating vacancy savings that more would naturally flow if you chose into conservation.
Okay, understood. That's a very good clarification point. So thanks for bringing that up. So I'm in full support if staff can support moving up any work on the watershed earlier.
Okay. Larry?
Sure. Okay, I have perhaps a little different view of this. I have some questions. One thing I've been hung up on for a while is the rate of reserve replenishment. At the projected numbers, we're still talking 5 to 10 years to do it. What if we trimmed $1 million off of that, made it 4 million instead of 5 million? And I don't know that it would significantly impact the rate the reserves are replenished, but it would give us some more money. I'm not proposing necessarily any numbers, but I'm just throwing it out as an idea of a way to rebalance the budget.
If I could just on that, if the board is looking at that option, we'd want to, I think it'd be most helpful or needed to distinguish which reserves, right? Because the 5 is combined the water supply reserve with our kind of operating reserve. They're both 2.5 million separately.
Sure. And obviously the money can be pushed into anyone,
Right.
you know. But that's something to think about, I think, is that I have difficulties with the hard numbers. In other words, these are all decisions and there's no particular rule of thumb or guidance on how much it should be or how quickly it should be. I have asked the question about what level of reserves we should have at least 30 times in 18 years. I haven't got a straight answer yet, and I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying it's a hard number to come up with. It's very unclear. My favorite subject, Tiburon, has 3 years of budget in reserve. Now, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's what they feel they need. I don't know. I think it's just because they have it. But I don't know, you know, there are obviously minimums, but I don't know what the maximum is or what rate we should achieve that at. You know, we don't know if we're facing another drought. And, you know, I can feel from the financial side, I do see it from your eyes. But that may not be the deciding factor. You know, it's just like the $1 million a month. I understand plugging the hole, but you know, how you plug the hole matters. And that's the tricky part. The Sonoma Water grant, is that just us and them, or is it all the partners?
There's a Sonoma Marin partnership that is Sonoma Water and all the contractors that applied for the grant. The 700,000 is our portion of that.
Okay. Another topic that is perhaps a little off schedule here is I've been getting, as you know, Ben, heat about which was a shock to me. Maybe that was stated, but I never digested it. We have apparently stopped people from picking up water, recycled water, or we don't make it available.
Yeah, that operation was done in concert with the drought. Knowing as we did it, that this issue would likely come up because people think it's free water. It's actually not if they looked at the gas it takes to get there and back and what they, but
that's their problem.
That's their problem. So it, you know, isn't on our site. It took quite a lot of staff and overtime, and it was actually hard filling those positions. Most of the programs, if not all of them, that operate on an ongoing basis are at wastewater treatment plants where you have existing staff that can manage the operation. So I am aware of some folks that would like us just to continue that ongoing. But it was put into place for the drought with the understanding when the drought's over, at least the understanding maybe not full of our entire rate base.
And perhaps we could discuss with Jason Dow a little more about the manning of that. I mean, I think it's a good program. You know, those of us at the NBWA meetings have heard about American Canyon's system, which likely doesn't meet the standards that are in place, because what they do is distribute water at no cost to red barrels that are in people's front yards. Now, I assume they're still doing that. It's the last I heard, which was like a week, 2 weeks ago. They're still doing it. And it was very popular. So it's something to think about. You know, I think it's a good thing if we can do it. Maybe we could get Las Colinas to do it if CSMA is hung up on this issue. CSMA has better quality water than, Las Colinas has better quality water than CSMA.
Right.
And that's something to think about, because I'd like to at least kick tires around getting that back in place. More to say we have it perhaps than
Right.
really do a lot. And I think we're still a little light on our water efficiency budgets. So anything we can do to enhance that, I think, is useful, because it does two factors. It cuts off the need for more water, and it reduces people's bills, so it makes the water more affordable potentially. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
And just related, and we'll be updating the board certainly in detail at upcoming board meetings. Our current demand, and of course, we haven't had very hot spells, is still notably lower than typical, probably still in the close to the 20% range, reduced from our normal baseline.
Yeah. Also, one more thing to keep in mind is I know you guys are envisioning this as a rate increase, but the real rate increase, I think, is going to be on the tier changes. Those discussions were held at least 15 times since I've been on the board, whether we should change that summertime allotment or not. All 15 times, except for the last one, it was decided not to change it. So I'm a little concerned about what's going to happen as you and I have talked, Ben, about September, with respect to, I think, Jed's talking about the tier 4s, but I think there's going to be a lot of people in tier 4 that weren't in tier 4, people that in tier 2 that are now in tier 3. So I expect to see some significant pushback, just a heads up, coming on these issues, more, I think, than on the dollar amount of the increase. So be aware, it's coming.
Okay, thank you. And Jed?
Was that a supportive option 1, 2, or 3? I couldn't tell.
I don't think it's appropriate to take a position before the vote. So
It's a vote. Okay. I would say that I am supportive of option 2. I think I appreciate, Larry, your comment about increasing investment in water efficiency and demand reduction investments. And so I'd be in support of option 2 and take a look in September and see what else we can do more to help our critical habitat, more to help our watershed, more to help our reduce our invasive species, and more to help our water efficiency and demand reduction measures. I also feel strongly that we should not reduce our reserve. I think our reserves are important. We've depleted our reserves in recent years to an astonishing extent. I think from 30 million down, more than half, because we did not increase rates. We did not prepare for drought. We did not invest in our infrastructure. And we're now setting aside reserves for the long term for supply that our community deserves. And I strongly resist cutting reserves that I think both for long-term supply, which we're building in, as well as for potential shortfall in the operating budget. So I think we need to be prudent and thoughtful and rebuild. And I think actually I would probably lean towards investing in reserves more than we're doing right now. It's going to take a long time to build back to where we were. I think maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe longer, to where we were just a few years ago. But I think as we look back on this decision tonight, I expect that our community will see that this is a clear shift to further invest in our critical habitat, to encourage our efficiencies in our system, to stave off the deterioration of our infrastructure and increase our water efficiency, resiliency for future generations. I'm strongly supportive. I'm happy that the staff has recommended to shift more towards the watershed and more towards water efficiency efforts. I'm supportive of your option 2 and your thoughtful approach to finding areas in the budget that we can do this. And then, yeah, I'm all supportive of looking for that in the future in September again. Thank you.
I'll try to make just a few remarks here. I want to first of all really thank staff. Oops, sorry. Alicia and Brett, thank you for all everything we're seeing here today is the tip of the iceberg of a lot of work that has gone on over the last 6 months. And I think that it really reflects a commitment that we have been expressing to really identify the things that we need to do. I think there's been a desire from our customers to see our district address what are seen as challenges for us to meet our water supply reliability and other parts of maintaining our system so that we have long-term reliability and can meet our obligations to deliver water. I think that this budget reflects commitments in the areas that we have said are really important in terms of making sure that we're dealing with our maintenance issues and we're not kicking cans down the road on anything, but we're getting at things at a measured pace. I think water supply reliability, given what we know about our vulnerabilities, having gone through what we did in the last couple of years, that kind of risk was obviously unacceptable. And so we're doing the right kind of things to get ahead of that. And we're making investments in that direction. I agree with Jed in terms of maintaining our reserves. I hate to say how that drought is not far away again. We also have a high risk of wildfire and earthquakes and other things, all of which will have significant costs upon the district, and our reserves will help us to weather those events when they do happen, because they will happen someday. We just don't know when. We always hope they're far away, but we need to be prepared if they're not. I want to recognize the creativity that we're exhibiting here. I think we have a very good budget. I think it's been well thought through. I think we are here at the last minute identifying maybe some creative ideas about dealing with the fact that while we have a budget going forward that brings us back to full staffing, and I want to really support us getting back to full staffing, because the staff that have not been replaced over the past year or plus has put a bigger burden upon our current staff. And I think it's increased strain. I think that it's been hard. And I think it's really important for us to get back to the level that is sustainable, because especially we have a very big job ahead of us with this budget. This budget allows us to do more. And I think we're going to need to be at our full staffing level in order to take advantage of this and really achieve the change that we need to. So, but at the same time, we can't hire 25 people, starting on July 1 when it's June 20th. So I think coming back and taking a look at the additional funds that we will have and figuring out where to put it. I'm a big fan of making sure that we have a really robust BIFIP budget, because with insurance companies pulling out of providing insurance coverage for homes that are in wildfire risk areas, I think that risk is going up now for people who are now more vulnerable than ever before. And I think increasing our investment there signals that we understand that risk and that we're trying to do something a little bit more to be responsive to a change in circumstances. I also want to I think go to something that Larry has raised, which is, is there something we can do to help people who are living in multifamily units to address their water, any impact of the rates? I don't know how we go about that, but I would encourage us to take a look at that. And if there is something that we can do with some additional funds that we have, I would be supportive of understanding what that is and seeing if that is another way that we could invest some money I know we're not talking about a huge amount of money that would be available, but I'd like to still think about that. And so with that, I think, I'm very supportive of this budget, but I think taking some time to come back in September to understand how we can maximize this additional small amount of funds. Really, frankly, we're not talking very much as a percentage of our total budget. To be creative about that, I think that's prudent. Any other board comments? Okay.
I just wanted to it's just such great work, Brett and the finance team, and Alicia working with Crystal on the CIP. And specifically, I just wanted to thank Alicia. She did so much juggling to make it here tonight on the home front. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have any public comments?
Yes, we have 3. The first, they are Roger Roberts, Ed Jameson, and Phil Sauter.
Good evening. Comprehensive presentation tonight, and thank you for that. I must confess some further confusion about exactly what we're going to be spending over the next years on the watershed, particularly to try to manage fire risks and get rid of invasive species. While you're going to be spending, I guess, somewhere between $3 and $4 million a year on this, whether that's really going to be sufficient to do what actually needs to be needed over time. I suspect that the need is much greater, and if we can find more money for that, I think that would be well spent. It may be necessary to go back and look at that more closely as we move forward. The watershed is, we have a watershed fee because of a recommendation made by a citizens advisory group in 2011, 2012. And we haven't really made a whole lot of progress, even though we've spent over that period of time probably $30 million. And so I think it would not hurt for you to pull all stops out to try to find more money for the watershed, not only within your own budget, but from other sources. And I would encourage the district to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ed Jameson, please, and then Phil Sauter.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thanks. This was an excellent wrap up to the budget process tonight. I'd particularly like to compliment Mr. Uppendahl and his staff for a really outstanding job on this complicated and prolonged undertaking. I believe it's important to address the wildfire risk as robustly as possible, and I'd like to support Mr. Roberts' comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Phil Sauter, then Larry Minikes.
Thank you for another fine presentation by staff and discussion by the board. My request to the board is to vote for option 3 with an interim report on today's proposal, plus specific stretch options for watershed and for conservation. There was a time 10 years ago when the watershed budget was extremely low. It was increased to $3 million, even though the watershed manager said it would require $6 million to make headway on invasive plants. 10 years later, we're finally getting the right budget, but as Director Sansom and Cush saw on their tour, invasives continue to spread. Invasives like French broom result in significant transpiration and reduce the productivity of the watershed, which is, I think we all agree, is the district's most valuable asset.
I think it needs more investment to keep it productive rather than deteriorating further. I appreciate the increased funding for conservation. In addition, it would be very helpful to look at a stretch option for conservation, and I'll suggest a pathway to develop that number. Step one, imagine that the weather continues to go crazy and we get ourselves into a serious drought in the next 3 years. Step two, list the ordinance that would be put in place to reduce outdoor water use by half. Step three, identify the incentive programs that would not require ordinances, but that would still reduce outdoor water use by half. Again, please vote option 3 and take a closer look at support for our watershed and for helping our customers find alternatives to using 40 to 50% of our potable water outdoors before a drought forces them to make the change abruptly and without notice. Without stretch goals, I think steady as she goes will probably leave us with a $400 million backlog after another 20 years. It'll just be a different $400 million backlog. So I request that we step on the gas and reduce the backlog. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Larry Minikes.
Yes, good evening. I think there's some symbolism here as I'm in Bingen, Washington on the Columbia River. And when we're speaking about water, there's a lot of water here. I want to second Roger Roberts' comments. I'm not going to repeat them, and appreciate that all the work that has gone into this and all the comments that really questions and challenges that the board has brought up tonight. It's been a very thoughtful process. We appreciate the work that has gone into this. We appreciate that there are options open. Obviously, option 2 and option 3 are where the board seems to be leaning. And overall, just good work on everyone's parts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. And Miss Marilyn Price.
Yes, hi. I just want to thank you all so much for all your time overseeing this most important issue of water in Marin County. Until I started attending your meetings, I didn't realize what a huge job it is, and you are doing an excellent job. I would just like to say just a very general comment here that in my mind, it is so important to look way ahead when making decisions in light of what I view as going to be a most difficult future. Regarding supplying additional water for our county, I feel conservation going forward should be a priority, and decisions are made so that Marin residents learn to live within our county's water limits and preserve our environment at the same time. And I hope you and all of us can stay on top of measures that are used around the world to conserve water, which is something we cannot live without. Thank you.
Thank you. And there are no further speakers.
Any other board comments?
Clarification question here on the budget adoption considerations. You've laid out option 1, 2, and 3. Do we have to stick with those? Or are we able to change those at all in terms of using the same parts and pieces, but creating a new option?
I think at this point, unless I'm corrected by Molly, there'd be flexibility at this point. I think, of course, constrained by the buckets that Brett referred to.
Were you going to propose something? I
was almost there. Thank you for helping.
Yeah,
me.
you can change anything, I think, at this point,
Right.
if you want.
So maybe the question then to Brett and Molly, then if we looked at a budget now with the projected savings, using that for the water conservation piece, as well as moving up the BIFIP money, would that be okay if we did both of those into one?
Yeah, I think if you were to make a motion to adopt the budget, essentially what you'd be saying is to increase BIFIP funding and be directing staff to kind of offset that in other capital areas, and then to come back in September with one-time funds? Or are you saying you want to go ahead and pre-program the one-time savings of a certain amount and dedicate that in the budget?
I think either or, but would either or be okay on the second option, pre-programming?
I think they're both okay.
Okay,
Is what I'm saying,
right,
yes.
thank you. With that, I think, moving up the wildfire money to this year, or the BIFIP this year, is something that I definitely support. I mean, it's only going to get more expensive to do this work, and the plants aren't going to stop growing. Unfortunately, we can't restrain photosynthesis. And that's what's really getting.
What you need to do is make a motion. That's where this is headed.
Right.
So
I think he's talking
just
about
make the
what he
motion
wants to
and say
do.
whatever it is you're trying to say. If it's 2, make the motion for 2. I don't see any other way to differentiate between the 3. We'd have to vote first on that and then on the other thing. But I think you can do it in the motion.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think if that's where Director Sampson was going is
Or at least was trying to go.
okay.
You're getting there. You're getting there.
Well, a few speed bumps popped up, Larry. I have to make sure to make my way over them. So
I think you had it. I mean, what you're saying makes sense to me.
Yep. So I think I'd like to go ahead and make a motion to approve the current budget with the addition of the one-time savings being programmed immediately for the conservation piece, and then moving up $500,000 in the CIP budget this year from the BIFIP, and then offset it in future years out.
Well done. Second.
Okay, so normally we have an order for votes, but we might have gotten a little out of it. But so that is the motion that is put forward. We will now do a roll call vote.
Vice President Kush,
700,000.
Can I make a comment? Well,
yeah,
I just wanted to note, as a member of the public said, if I had not been on the watershed just last Friday, maybe I would be less convinced about the importance of what Director Sampson proposed as an option. But yeah, so.
Are we
strong.
allowed to clarify what the actual motion is here? Or do we have to vote right now with what was said?
If there are questions about the motion, we can either repeat it or have it repeated so that you're understanding what
I guess
we're.
my question, Matt, is how is that motion different than option 2?
It's not. It is essentially
agree.
option 2. And I did want to clarify that is what you're suggesting, specifically $700,000 in one-time savings to move towards the conservation.
I think it's option 2, clarifying the and instead of the or.
Yep, that's it.
if I'm
Thank you.
correct.
Yeah, moving it up with the investment in
Moving
up 1 year.
moving forward with the BIFIP investment in the current in the upcoming year, and using the one-time savings from salary savings of up to 700,000 in the water efficiency programming.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. And Larry said second. Is that where we stand?
Yeah, sure. I'll go with the second on that.
Okay. Sorry, Monty. Thank you.
Director Larry Russell,
Yes.
thank you. Director Matt Sampson,
Aye.
Director Jed Smith,
Aye.
and President Monty Schmidt.
Aye. Okay, thank you, everybody, for your patience and for staying late. We're going to move on to our final item, which is number 7, future meeting items. Terry.
Yes, good evening. So this Thursday, we will have our Finance and Administration Committee meeting at 9:30. Our next regular bi-monthly board meeting is Tuesday, July 11th, and then we'll go on to the ops meeting right after that, which is Friday, July 21st. Then an external meeting we have is the North Bay Watershed Association meeting on July 7th. And that's all I have for tonight.
Okay, with that, we are
One-
adjourned.
One more
Oh,
comment. The NBWRA meeting was canceled. Was a meeting scheduled for the 26th. That's been zapped.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and now with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, folks.